Imagine standing behind a stone parapet, packed earth beneath your boots, the acrid stink of black powder hanging in the autumn air. You are an imperial gunner defending one of the strongest fortresses on the Rhine. You have faced cannon fire before. You know the rhythm of a siege. You hear the distant boom. You count the seconds. You listen for the high whistling arc. And you brace. The ball crashes into the wall or sails overhead and buries itself in the dirt behind you. That is what artillery does. That is what it has always done. But on this October morning in 1688, at the fortress of Philipsburg, something is different. You hear the boom, but there is no whistle. Instead, there is a sharp, flat crack, almost like a whip snapping across stone. And before your mind can make sense of that sound, a 12-pound iron cannonball appears at chest height, not falling from above, not arcing down, but skipping forward across the top of the parapet like a stone hurled across the surface of a lake. It strikes the first cannon in your battery and sends a shower of wooden splinters and iron fragments screaming through the air. But it does not stop. It bounces. It skips again. It tears through the next gun crew, then the next, ripping a bloody line through an entire stretch of your defensive works in a single horrifying second. Men who were standing upright a heartbeat ago are now on the ground. Cannons that were loaded and ready to fire are now wrecked. And the ball, still tumbling, still carrying lethal energy, finally comes to rest somewhere deep inside the fortress, having done the work of a dozen conventional shots in one. That was Ricochet fire. And the man who unleashed it was about to change siege warfare forever. His name was Sébastien de Vauban, and he was not a king, not a field marshal leading cavalry charges, and not the kind of figure who typically ends up in the history books alongside Napoleon or Alexander. He was an engineer, mathematician, a man who looked at fortress walls and cannon trajectories and saw geometry where others saw only brute force. And yet what Vauban did at Philipsburg in 1688, and what he continued to refine for years afterward, was arguably more important than any single battlefield victory of his era. Because Vauban did not just build better walls or dig better trenches. He figured out how to weaponize physics itself, how to turn the simple act of firing a cannonball into something so efficient, so devastating, and so psychologically terrifying that entire garrison defenses could be dismantled with a fraction of the ammunition that conventional bombardment required. And the story of how he did it begins not with Vauban himself, but with the political earthquake that put a French army outside Philipsburg's gates in the first place. In the autumn of 1688, Europe was a powder keg. Louis XIV, the Sun King of France, had spent years expanding French territory through a combination of military conquest and legal manipulation. He had seized lands along the Rhine through a series of so-called reunions, legal proceedings backed by French courts that conveniently ruled that various border territories historically belonged to France. The Holy Roman Empire, led by the Habsburg dynasty, had been too distracted to push back effectively because the Habsburgs were locked in a massive war against the Ottoman Empire in the east. But by 1688, that Eastern War was going well for the Habsburgs. The Ottomans were being pushed back, and Louis XIV could see the writing on the wall. Once the Habsburgs were free from the Ottoman threat, they would turn their attention westward, and France's illegally seized territories along the Rhine would be the first thing they came for. Worse still, France's diplomatic position was eroding. Former allies and neutral parties were drifting toward the Habsburg camp. The electorate of Cologne, a strategically vital territory on the Rhine, was slipping out of French influence. Louis faced a choice: wait and risk being surrounded by a coalition of hostile powers, or strike first while the empire was still committed in the east and seize the key positions that would make France's frontier defensible. Louis chose to strike. French armies crossed the Rhine in September 1688, pouring into the Palatinate and the Rhineland. And at the top of the target list was one fortress in particular, Philipsburg. It sat on the eastern bank of the Rhine, a position of extraordinary strategic value. Whoever held Philipsburg held a bridgehead across one of Europe's most important rivers. It was a gateway into imperial territory, and, just as critically, a linchpin in any defensive line protecting France's eastern border. France had held Philipsburg before. In fact, Vauban himself had once fortified it, turning it into one of the most formidable positions in Europe. But the fortress had since been returned to the empire, and now the Imperials held it, garrisoned it, and armed it to the teeth. Taking it back was not a luxury. It was a necessity. Without Philipsburg, France's entire defensive architecture along the Rhine had a gaping hole in it. And so Louis XIV ordered the siege, assigning command to his eldest son, the Dauphin Louis, the heir to the French throne. But the Dauphin was not expected to mastermind the operation himself. He was there for prestige, for the glory of the royal house. The real brains behind the siege were the professionals at his side: Marshal Duras, one of France's most experienced military commanders, and Vauban, the greatest siege engineer the world had ever seen. The French force was enormous, somewhere between 30 and 40,000 troops supported by heavy artillery and mortars. A siege train designed to crack open even the strongest fortifications in Europe. The defenders, commanded by Maximilian von Starhemberg, were far fewer in number but well supplied with artillery pieces, and protected by thick walls and layered defensive works. Starhemberg and his men knew exactly who they were facing. Vauban's reputation preceded him like a thunderclap. The man had already perfected a system of siege warfare that had made him virtually unbeatable. His method of parallels, a system of organized trench networks that allowed besieging forces to approach a fortress safely and systematically, had revolutionized how sieges were conducted. Instead of throwing men at walls in bloody, wasteful assaults, Vauban's sappers would dig zigzag approach trenches, advancing closer and closer to the fortress while remaining protected from defensive gunfire. At set distances, they would dig lateral trenches, the parallels, where guns could be emplaced and troops could mass for the next phase. It was methodical, it was relentless, and it was almost impossible to stop. The French sappers began digging in late September, their shovels biting into the earth as the approach trenches snaked forward toward Philipsburg's walls. Starhemberg's gunners fired down at them, trying to disrupt the work, but the zigzag pattern of the trenches made it incredibly difficult to hit the diggers with any consistency. Day by day, the French lines crept closer, but Vauban was not content to simply repeat what he had done before. He had been thinking about a problem that had plagued siege warfare for as long as cannons had existed, and he believed he had found the solution. The problem was this: traditional siege bombardment was shockingly inefficient. Cannons firing at full powder charges launched their projectiles in high parabolic arcs. The balls would crash into fortress walls with tremendous force. Yes, but much of that energy was wasted. Balls would bury themselves in packed earthworks and simply stop. They would shatter against thick stone and scatter harmlessly. And the high angle of descent meant that defenders sheltering behind parapets or crouching in trenches were almost impossible to hit directly. You could pound a fortress for weeks, burning through mountains of expensive gunpowder, and still find the defenders largely intact behind their walls, their cannons still firing, their morale bruised but unbroken. There had to be a better way, and Vauban, with his engineer's mind and his obsessive attention to angles and trajectories, found it. The idea was deceptively simple, but required extraordinary precision to execute. Instead of using a full powder charge, Vauban ordered his gunners to use drastically reduced charges. Instead of aiming high to lob the ball over the walls, he instructed them to fire at extremely shallow angles, sometimes barely above the horizontal. The goal was to send the cannonball on a flat trajectory that would just barely clear the top of the enemy parapet. Once the ball crossed that lip of stone and earth, it would enter the defensive works at near ground level, still carrying enormous forward velocity. And here was the genius. Because it was moving forward rather than downward, the ball would not bury itself in the ground. It would bounce. It would skip. It would ricochet through the trench lines and gun emplacements like a deadly stone skimming across the surface of a pond. One single ball, fired with a fraction of the powder that a conventional shot required, could travel the entire length of a defensive position, dismounting cannons, shattering gun carriages, and cutting down every man in its path. French military guidance of the period recommended firing at astonishingly shallow elevations to achieve this effect, and Vauban drilled his gunners until they could calibrate their charges with surgical precision. But that precision was everything. The margin for error was razor thin. Too much powder and the ball would sail clear over the defensive works and waste itself in the open ground beyond. Too little, and it would strike the face of the parapet and stop dead. The gunner had to find the exact charge that would send the ball on a trajectory just high enough to clear the wall, and just flat enough to enter the trench system with killing speed. It was artillery as geometry, war as applied physics, and when it worked, it was devastating beyond anything the defenders had ever experienced. At Philipsburg, Vauban deployed ricochet fire systematically for what many historians consider the first major operational use of the technique. French batteries opened up with their reduced charges and flattened angles, and the effect on the imperial defenders was immediate and catastrophic. Cannonballs came skipping over the parapets at body height, tearing through positions that had been considered safe from conventional bombardment. There was nowhere to hide. A ball that enters a trench line at ground level and keeps bouncing does not care about your parapet. It does not care about your earthwork. It finds you wherever you are standing, crouching, or running. Gun crews were torn apart. Cannons were knocked from their mountings. Ammunition stores were struck and detonated. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical damage. Imperial soldiers who had been trained to endure conventional bombardment, who knew how to shelter behind walls and wait out the storm, suddenly found that the rules had changed. The storm was inside the walls now. It was bouncing through their positions at knee and chest height, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. But that precision was everything. The margin for error was razor thin. Too much powder and the ball would sail clear over the defensive works and waste itself in the open ground beyond. Too little, and it would strike the face of the parapet and stop dead. The gunner had to find the exact charge that would send the ball on a trajectory just high enough to clear the wall, and just flat enough to enter the trench system with killing speed. It was artillery as geometry, war as applied physics. And when it worked, it was devastating beyond anything the defenders had ever experienced. At Philipsburg, Vauban deployed ricochet fire systematically for what many historians considered the first major operational use of the technique. French batteries opened up with their reduced charges and flattened angles, and the effect on the imperial defenders was immediate and catastrophic. Cannonballs came skipping over the parapets at body height, tearing through positions that had been considered safe from conventional bombardment. There was nowhere to hide. A ball that enters a trench line at ground level and keeps bouncing does not care about your parapet. It does not care about your earthwork. It finds you wherever you are standing, crouching, or running. Gun crews were torn apart. Cannons were knocked from their mountings. Ammunition stores were struck and detonated. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical damage. Imperial soldiers who had been trained to endure conventional bombardment, who knew how to shelter behind walls and wait out the storm, suddenly found that the rules had changed. The storm was inside the walls now. It was bouncing through their positions at knee and chest height, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. The siege lasted 33 days. Starhemberg and his garrison fought with remarkable courage, but they were facing impossible odds. They were massively outnumbered, outgunned, and now outthought. Vauban's ricochet fire was dismantling their defenses faster than they could repair them, and the relentless advance of the French trenches was squeezing them tighter and tighter. On October 30th, 1688, Starhemberg surrendered the fortress. The siege had cost both sides blood. French casualties numbered in the hundreds, and imperial losses were significant as well. But the critical point was the speed. Philipsburg had fallen far faster than the previous imperial capture of the fortress. That speed was not an accident. It was the direct result of Vauban's innovation. Ricochet fire had compressed the timeline of the siege, chewing through defensive positions that would have taken weeks to reduce by conventional methods. But the story does not end at Philipsburg. Vauban continued to refine ricochet fire in subsequent sieges throughout the 9 Years' War and beyond, perfecting the technique and integrating it into French artillery doctrine. And the rest of Europe took notice. By the early 18th century, ricocheting round shot had become a standard method in siege warfare across the continent. Armies that had once laughed at the idea of deliberately reducing powder charges and firing low were now training their own gunners to do exactly that, because the results were undeniable. A technique that used less powder, fewer projectiles, and simpler physics was outperforming the brute force bombardment that had defined siege warfare for centuries. Ricochet fire remained a critical tool in the artillery arsenal for generations, sweeping enemy lines and trench works with lethal efficiency until the development of explosive shells in the 19th century finally made solid-shot ricochet tactics obsolete. And that, ultimately, is the real lesson of Philipsburg and of Vauban's career. Military revolutions do not always come from bigger weapons, larger armies, or more destructive firepower. Sometimes they come from a single man standing behind a cannon, staring at a fortress wall, and asking a question that no one else thought to ask. Not how do I hit that wall harder, but how do I make this ball keep moving after it crosses that wall? Vauban answered that question with geometry, with physics, and with the kind of relentless intellectual precision that turned a simple iron cannonball into the most terrifying weapon on the 17th century battlefield. They laughed at his battle plan. Then their entire army was destroyed.